Welcome to Daily Devotions, and we are making our way through our Genesis series. We're still in chapter 1, and we're on the 6th day of creation, and a lot of things are happening on the 6th day of creation. It's actually kind of a long reading, and I'm not going to be able to talk about the whole thing. So I'm not going to read to the whole 6th day. You'll find it once again in chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 26 and 27 because I want to talk about this verse that says something about us being created in God's image. So let me just read you these two verses. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Wow, I just read those two verses, and in my mind is racing just with those two verses. There are so many things that we could talk about. But it's been one of those old chestnuts of theology to look at this question of what does it mean to be made in the image of God. By the way, when I talk about theology, you may be hearing that word differently than I do. To me, when I think of theology, the first thing that comes to mind is a really good map. And just like there's different kinds of theologies, there's different kinds of maps. There's satellite maps and topographical maps and street maps, and they all have a value for a certain time and place. But a good map is a map that helps you to know where you are and where you need to go. So theology is not the same thing as trusting in God or following God's will, but it is a powerful tool to not get lost, or when you face a situation, to understand where you're at. That's theology. But one of the theological questions over the ages has been, what does it mean that we were created in the image of God, or that we are like God? I'm not good with dates, but let's just say 100 years ago, especially during the Enlightenment, that's even more than 100 years ago, there was a concept that being in the image of God was to be smart, to be able to think, to reason, to be able to communicate. Prior to that, a lot of people thought the image of God meant physically that God looked like a human being. You'll find, 1,000 years ago, they weren't afraid to paint God on the top of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and have him look like a rather buff-looking old dude with a beard. Now, what does it mean to be in the image of God? Different theologians, they talk about responsibility. They talk about morality, that we are morally responsible for the things we do. Some people talk about that we're in the image of God in that, that God has called us to create things. But it always seems to happen this. What is underneath that is, how are we different from the rest of creation? Or another way is, why can we justify ourselves being above creation? And there's problems at that. There's problems in that because sometimes it sets us loose to play God. We are made to be like God. I want to flip that on its head. Let's start off. I've got something I want to show you. It's rather old. It's about 20 years old, and no comments in the section about how skinny I used to be. But This is a old portrait, an old church directory portrait with my kids. I'm guessing my daughter is maybe about 1 or 2 at tops, and my son must be about 5, just cute as buttons. And you can see my wife and I, one pre-wrinkled days for me. My wife looks exactly the same. Anyway, but if you look at my kids, you know, well, they're just adorable. I love them. But even at this age, we could see features in our children, physical features, and sometimes attributes like creativity or lack thereof, or things like that, that were like me or like my wife. As they have gotten older, I mean, I still very much see my children as being their own selves, but every now and then I catch something in my daughter and say, oh, that's like me. I understand where she's at. Or I see something in my son, I say, that's like me. And you can certainly love another person without having them to be like you. But it is remarkable when you find something like you in another person. Even my wife and I, obviously not genetically related, but after 30 plus years of being together, there are so many things that we do that are like each other because we have this relationship. And that's what I want to take you to today. Maybe when we hear in the Bible that God created us and God sees us as being like God, it's like seeing a bit of yourself inside of somebody you love. It's a sympathy. It's a connection. That's what God sees in us, in all human beings. Think of the person that is the least example to you of what a human being should be. You just don't like them. You think that they're a poor excuse for a human being. And then think of God, who says, yeah, but I see myself in them, and I can't let them go, and I can't abandon them. To abandon them is to abandon myself. We have that verified in other parts of Scripture. And so I think that is a foundation for us to start with, to say that if we are made to be like God, the first thing that we should accept is that God sees a bit of God's self in you and I, and a little bit of God's self in others around us. And what a beautiful thing that would be if what God sees of God's self in us could actually get fuller life. That the kind of love, compassion, forgiveness, grace, mercy, joy, peace, kindness, gentleness that emanates from God. That God would look at us at whatever stage we are in our life and say, I still see that in you. That's a beautiful thing. And I think the question is, are we more special than other creation? That's a bad question. The question we need to ask ourselves is, are all the human beings around us special to God? And are they precious? And do they need to be loved and cared and respected? Yeah. We are like God because God sees God's self in us.